Hello everyone, Ian Zeglin here. I was the person that presented the Ley Field presentation at the conference at OFA this year. I wanted to give everyone updates on some of the things that we were trying on the farm. I think that showing with video is a little more productive than showing just by typing something out or pictures. So we're just going to take a second here to kind of go over some of the successes and failures of the project in this kind of 2020 season, or 2022 season. What I'm standing in front of right here is a mess. We tried two different overwintering methods for our soil this year that I am not a fan of either. One was this kind of silage cover. While I think that it did a really good job for the soil in terms of soil care, it was really hard to get the soil to dry out this spring. I don't know where everyone is located, but down here near Cincinnati, we've had an unbelievable amount of rain this year, and having this kind of wet mass of carbon on top of the soil has really hindered us from getting the soil work done that we need to get done to get things in the ground. On top of that, it also I don't think that what we got was super clean, and we brought a lot of weed seeds in, and as you can see behind me, there was greens in here, but they were terrible. And so while I do think that it's an effective method for taking care of soil, I'm not sure if it makes sense in a market style production, especially if you live in a wet area. I do think there might be some, with anything, some ways to maybe tarp on top of your straw or things like that, and we are trying some of that in a different part of this plot, which we'll hopefully be able to update you in the future on. But for now, so far, I will not be doing silage again as a cover next year. It just wasn't what I really wanted on the farm. The second thing was to just tarp. Basically we had production, we tarped it, and we left it tarped all winter. This did do a good job of having nice weed-free beds early in the season, beds that we could work, but I felt that with this production system, it wasn't a great way to keep the biology as active as we could in that soil. I think that if we had kind of worked that soil and gotten an overwintered cover crop in it and then tarped in the spring, which we'll kind of go over where we did that, that would be a much better way to do it. Just the tarping alone, all the crops we put in there afterwards just were not great. I do think that the soil compaction is a major part of this project. Having the soil loose enough for planting and loose enough for the biology to thrive is something that we've kind of struggled with getting it just right. I know that when we are getting good cover crop roots in the soil, we are keeping that soil loose enough with those roots to keep the compaction away that we're kind of worried about. But for now, what I can say is silage was bad. Just tarping with no other amendments, whether that be living roots or compost, not good. So the next overwintering method that I want to talk about is one that I liked a lot. So this is a plot that we kind of built raised beds in the fall. We wood chipped the paths, and then what we did was I broadcasted really heavily, like a winter cover crop mix. I believe it was rye, crimson clover, peas, vetch, something kind of in that realm of winter hardy cover crops. And I almost seeded them like you would microgreens, like really dense, probably 200% the amount you're supposed to seed for acreage or whatever, if you really want to kind of get into that. What came up is this really dense mat of cover crops that kept a living root in the soil all winter long, and something that I was really kind of impressed with throughout the whole winter. Impressed with over the winter does not necessarily translate into something that is good for production, because I was really happy with what the silage was doing, and now I'm not. But what we did was in the spring, we tarped that cover crop, that dense cover crop, and what I found was that these winter cover crops, when they're young, the termination time with a silage tarp on top was very short, which I was not expecting. We had the cover crop covered for maybe just a week, even in the winter, which if anyone uses tarps, the hotter it is, the more effective they are. But even this cover crop in that winter kind of sun died very quickly, which I thought was awesome. It means that, in the spring when we're trying to get that that soil ready and get that time in the soil, or that timing for soil work and stuff right, that if you have this cover crop, this dense cover crop, you can terminate it with maybe a week or two in advance notice and be ready to work the soil pretty much right afterwards. What we did here after we cover cropped was we put a light application of compost on. On some of our plots, we're trying compost this year. So this plot would have been dense cover crop, a little bit of compost, and wood chip paths. It's kind of hard to see the wood chip paths now. They've kind of been washed in a bit. We were a little bit shy about wood chips and compost and not wanting to add kind of too much of anything because we weren't really sure exactly how we wanted to get this plot to work. But what I can say is that it was all fantastic. Our brassica patch has been great this year. We grew all paste tomatoes in here last year, so it's a pretty heavy feeder. And then to just kind of jump from heavy feeder into another heavy feeder and have a successful crop, I think is a powerful kind of thing for this system. It's cool to see that we have either built up enough fertility or we're able to manage the fertility we had with cover crops and that little bit of compost with enough to kind of get our second crop out of it this year. And I think that what's going to happen is we'll remove this crop, maybe tarp it for a little bit, add some more compost as kind of a mulch, and then keep cropping on this with light feeders. I'm really happy with the overwintering system of the dense cover crop. I think it's something that we will be using maybe exclusively on some of our plots, our early spring plots moving forward. So this is a bit of a closer look at what I was kind of talking about. I don't know if you guys can see quite perfectly, but we do have some wood chips here for pathways, and we went quite shallow with them. And we went quite light with the compost. I think that it didn't do enough to suppress weeds on either end, the pathway or the beds. And I think that looking forward, we have some examples that you'll see a little bit later in this video of where we went heavier with each of those things. And I think that that's going to be a really big benefit for a system like this, because weed pressure is our kind of big issue, which I think for everyone it is. And we're working on ways to kind of get better at suppressing that and make it easier for the crew to kind of get through the cropping season without having to weed like crazy. So this is the fourth overwintering system that we've used so far this year. This was just a drilled stand of the same cover crops that we use with the, what I'm calling like the microgreen style cover cropping, the really dense stuff, which is just, again, rye, crimson clover, Austrian winter pea, and hairy vetch. In kind of late, probably mid-May, I would say, actually, this was 6 feet tall or so. And what we did is we came through and we mowed it. I think that I had to come through here with a brush hog, and then came back over with a flail mower that we have on the BCS. And what we ended up with now is this kind of bit of stubble, and we just tarped that about a week ago in preparation for working this soil next week for winter squash. I found that the just drilling of cover crops in the winter is almost always great. Now, we didn't always drill cover crops. We've done a lot of just broadcast and incorporate it that way, which works really well. You just seed really heavy and then drag something over top of it. We've even had the crew out here with chains on an old mattress with cinder blocks on it, kind of pull over top of broadcasted seeds to get it in the ground. And that also works fairly fine as long as you get the seed in before November. But this system has actually worked really great for us. The soil is so supercharged after that cover crop, that winter cover crop. And although we are seeing some weeds pop up now, the tarp usually takes care of most of those to begin with in the season. So we can reduce our weed pressure by quite a bit. So I would say that between all four overwintering methods, both of the ones that I like involve living roots, and the termination of those cover crops is pretty easy, in my opinion, in the spring. We're going to be experimenting with like rolling down some cover crops and making mulches with them. Things like kind of roller crimping the rye or stepping down the rye. We're going to do a little bit of experimentation with that over the next year or so, because I think that'd be a really cool way to keep the soil mulched, but we'll kind of see where we land on that. So, we're always trying to move towards reducing tillage, and when we do these cover crops, I kind of talked about battling compaction a bit. I've found that we get such a fantastic root structure here in this soil. It's really wet right now, so it's hard to see. I just forked up another piece and all I saw was worms, which is pretty cool. Right here you can even see some, maybe a worm or two there. But these roots are going down as deep as this fork goes, and I'm going to do my best to, when we get ready to plant this crop, this winter squash crop, to just work the soil as shallow as possible and leave as much of that intact root mass as possible down there, which I think is really, at the end of the day, the ultimate benefit of just getting the winter cover crops drilled in. And it's something that we're lacking with the silage and with the tarp is this action, these deep roots. And I think that makes a huge difference in this system to keep our biology alive and keep our soil loose. So if you guys will recall, one of the big parts of the presentation that we're working on this year is not just building fertility with animals, but maintaining fertility as much as possible during the growing season. So this kind of bit of a messy area here is a couple crops that we did, and this is the area that was just tarped. Across the board, we've had fairly poor crops out of this area, but one of the things that I'm really happy with so far is these living paths. This right here, this living path, is teff grass and some clover in there. The clover never quite seems to be able to compete with foot traffic, but the teff grass does, and it kind of acts as a bit of a nursery for that clover. And so I'm excited to see if we can kind of really get these paths going. Once they get to a certain point of the year, you can actually just kind of step or weed whip these down and they just turn to mulch. So keeping, again, this living root in the soil as much as possible. In these beds that were tarped all winter with all this compaction, any kind of living root I can get in the soil, I'm happy with. A kind of interesting example too is we've had, kind of fairly poor cropping in this area, but we have a beautiful stand of oats and vetch right here that is doing great. Plenty of fertility in the soil, but again, I think it's just making sure that the biology is there to facilitate growing, and that the lack of compaction is there so that those plant roots can get going. And I really do believe that in this patch where we've had issues, compaction is our main issue, and it was because of that overwintered tarping. I do believe that it could be remedied by soil work in the spring. I don't know where you guys are located, but it seems like every spring it just keeps getting wetter and wetter. And so again, I think that means that it's not a good system moving forward if we're going to continue to have, such wet springs. So this is something I'm really excited about with this project. This would have been began this season as cover crop. This last year was pasture. We took that cover crop, we built up raised beds, and I was really happy with how the soil looked. But as again, one of our ways of trying to conserve that nice soil and not kind of burn it out by using it for production too much, was to take those raised beds, give them a really, really heavy compost mulch, and then fill these pathways with wood chips. Again, this system, we're building fertility. We're finding that we're building fertility. What we're lacking is ease of production in the sense of weeding, mostly, which I think is most people's problem on a farm. But we're hoping that this heavy compost mulch really kind of keeps the weeds at bay. Is it adding fertility to our plot? Yeah, certainly. We do make this compost on the farm. It's a heavier carbon compost than it is kind of anything else, and so it makes a really good mulch. And so we're hoping that what this can do is take the time to kind of prepare the beds correctly now, adding as much carbon to these blocks of production as possible, add as much weed suppression to these blocks as possible. And if these plots look good, I do believe that this might be a really great way to run the system moving forward. We have all that fertility built up by the animals and cover crops, and that is now taken care of underneath this kind of heavy carbon cover, which I think is going to make a big difference. This system is really inspired by the kind of European no-dig method. It does require having compost on property or buying in compost, which can be tough depending on your location. But what I can say is spending the time to make a weed-free compost isn't super extreme, and so far the benefits of it have been amazing, at least for us on our farm. I would say that the labor requirement to get all of these wood chips and compost and everything in place is a lot. And so I want to report back on whether or not to just do a handful of beds here. It almost took 3 or 4 of us half a day, a full day. But if it's half a day, a full day to get these beds covered, and then we're not weeding like crazy throughout the whole season, I will kind of be able to report, I think, that this is a success. I'll be kind of maybe in a later video this season reporting back on how this is working for us and whether this is a viable system or not. So this is a plot that was in production last year and is moving into now 2 years of pasture. I'm really, really happy with this particular plot. Because you can see that a large portion of it is kind of mulched down. The sheep that grazed it this spring did all that mulching themselves. What we've done now is come over on top of all that with a drill and gotten our next round of cover crop, a warm season cover crop for the season in this plot. But this little row right here that still has some grasses in it, that was something I didn't get cover crop very well early enough in the fall, and so I do think that seeing this right here, this beautiful kind of mulched, very low weed pressure area, I think that we'll probably be trying to do an earlier fall cover cropping than we have previously, because again, where we weren't able to get it as quite established, we're seeing regrowth of weeds pretty bad. Hopefully this update has been helpful for you guys, or you find it interesting. We're looking to do as much education as possible about this project. So if there's anyone else we'd like to reach this video out to, we'd be happy to do that. Again, we'll be reporting once a season. So towards the end of summer, you'll be seeing something from us about what's kind of happening and some of the things I've talked about so far in this video. And hopefully report back that things are going very well. I hope everyone's having a good season. You're not getting rained out too much and everyone's staying nice and cool. Thank you so much.